Well, in Australia, there's a piece of legislation they've been trying to push through, and they've got part of it through, where they're starting to demand an increase of surveillance on what they call terrorist behaviour or extremist behaviour, which they don't really define, but when they talk about it, they usually include things like the protests against the government during COVID and anything that endangers safety, which they can say, well, if you're protesting against a vaccine mandate, you're endangering public safety. Do you think there's a dangerous line here where we start calling civil protests for freedom terrorism?
Well, absolutely. And we know that it's only going to be used in one direction. We have in Canada a large division around oil and gas sector development. And you have some Indigenous communities that are very resistant to oil and gas development. Usually, though, it's white liberals that appropriate Indigenous concerns against oil and gas. But we had about a year and a half before the convoy, we had Indigenous groups that were protesting by blocking railways, that were setting up these little encampments on railways. They were blocking critical infrastructure. And there was no use of the Emergencies Act to deal with them. There was no rhetoric about them being terrorists. There was none of what we saw when a bunch of truckers decided to park in front of Parliament Hill.
Well, I have to say that Canada came the closest to overthrowing the COVID mafia. Their freedom convoy was watched by residents imprisoned by their governments across the West. I mean, I certainly watched it from my small apartment that I hadn't been able to leave for the best part of 8 months. So why, Andrew, do we see nations who were once famous for their history of liberty and victory over tyrannical regimes, why were its residents unable to fight against history's least talented dictators? Because, let's be honest, Daniel Andrews, Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau, they are the 240p dial-up version of Stalin.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think that there are two things. One is that so many people bought into the fear because they didn't see it as being oppression, because they were told and they believed what they were being told, that this was all hashtag for your own good, hashtag stay home, save lives, and all of that. So I think that a lot of the time people really believed that what they were doing was the right thing. And the second part of that is what the governments did everywhere in Australia and Canada and the UK, and it was very brilliant. They drove wedges between people. They prevented them from gathering together to talk with their friends about, hey, I don't really like this policy. What do you think? They prevented them from having large family gatherings or even small-sized family gatherings where you might say, you know, this seems a little bit much, doesn't it? So by driving those wedges as early and effectively as government did, people didn't even have the worlds in which they could get together and realize that they weren't alone in this. And it was when people started breaking down those walls, because people had had enough, that they started to realize, oh, wow, no, this is not a normal way to live. And I am not alone in this. Other people think this is a little weird too. Well,
quite literally, one of our mainstream news broadcasters said, don't invite your unvaccinated relatives to Christmas dinner because you might kill your grandparents. That's how you isolate people from the most important family get-togethers, and you weren't even allowed to speak to people online because they were removed from the social media network. So as you say, they were isolated and ideas were not allowed to be discussed because it might be dangerous. Heaven forbid you question the government. But this might be an unfair question, but I don't care, you can handle it because you're awesome. But in your opinion, why do you think the mainstream press has devolved into this parasite of left-wing political parties? Because we are at the mercy of an ideological monopoly.
I've thought about that a lot, and I think that the practical concern is that in Canada anyway, and I'm assuming it's probably very similar in Australia, the people that are going into journalism are graduates of urban, large city journalism programs at elite universities that have never been to the rural parts of the country, that have never spoken to someone who's different from them. And it's the people that are then taken from, in a Canadian context, downtown Toronto, that go to school in downtown Toronto, and then they're plucked in rural Saskatchewan and told to be a journalist. And they don't understand it. They don't want to understand it. So I think that's the practical. But there's something more fundamental too. And I've said to people when they talk about bias that journalists will criticize left-wing politicians. But when they criticize left-wing politicians, it's for not living up to their ideal of what a progressive politician is supposed to be. When the press criticizes conservative politicians, it's for their beliefs. It's for actually fundamentally being who they are.